Hello and welcome to The Future is Spoken, produced by the Digital Assistant Academy. This show accompanies the Digital Assistant Academy's course entitled Voice Interaction Design. Conversational AI is changing the landscape of traditional web and mobile applications. Investing in conversational AI provides a lot of benefit to the enterprise, like enhancing customer engagement, workforce operations, and business partner integrations. In today's episode, Shyamala Praga speaks with Greg Bennett on designing conversational bots for enterprise. They dive deeper into Salesforce's Einstein Bot Builder, conversation design best practices for enterprise, and more. Greg Bennett is conversation design principal at Salesforce, leading the company's first dedicated conversation design practice since its inception. As a linguist, Greg focuses his work on empowering businesses to create chatbots that feel natural and helpful, build user trust, and meet customer expectations for conversational behavior. Greg works with Salesforce's product teams, customers, and partners to tailor their conversation designs for cross-cultural differences across channels and user populations and effectively express personality or conversational style. Enjoy the show.
Welcome, Greg.
Thanks so much, Shamal. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm actually excited to have you because Salesforce has been in a lot of news with the Einstein bot and all the things. So really looking forward to our chat today.
Likewise, it's great to be here.
Yeah, so Greg, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us about your background.
Sure. So my academic background is in linguistics. I studied linguistics for my undergraduate and graduate work. And so for folks who are not super familiar with what linguistics is, it's really the science of how language works in practice. I focused specifically on interactional sociolinguistics, which is understanding how people use language in everyday interaction, whether that is face-to-face or over chat. And that was really what was the foundation for my transition into conversational AI. My sort of interest in that space began because I got broken up with over IM chat, and I could tell it was coming. And so I started thinking like, okay, how could I know, despite not seeing the other person's face or hearing their voice, that they were seeming distant? And what I learned through linguistics is that when you establish this baseline pattern of communicating with another person and you deviate from that in some way, it sends a signal to the other person saying, hey, something has changed. And when I did this postmortem on that breakup, I realized that up until that point, he and I had been chatting with not all of the formal aspects of writing. We weren't capitalizing everything. We weren't using a ton of punctuation. And then he started to put more of that in. And by doing so, that sort of triggers this more sort of formal register of using language. And that in and of itself makes it seem distant and thereby cold. And so I took those findings and that training and applied it to the world of tech, where I thought, okay, if we can understand systematically how humans signal to each other the status of their relationship and negotiate transactions through language, if we know how that works structurally, then we can take those and convert those into design principles or design patterns that we can use to teach bots to very strategically try to accomplish a particular outcome using conversation. So that's my background.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And you are the 8th linguist I'm speaking to for this podcast.
Ooh, yeah, I like that.
So
there we go.
Every second person I've been talking to, they come from linguistics background. So looks like linguistics is getting pretty famous with conversational, because it does make sense to a certain extent. Linguistics, you learn about all the different ways of speaking, the dialects and all of those. And it's somewhere how I feel like helps when we are designing bots and chatbots or voice bots.
I think, yeah, the training in linguistics is very helpful. I think my goal is to figure out how I can socialize that a lot more without folks having to necessarily go off and do a whole degree in linguistics in order to learn the sort of way of thinking that you learn when you study linguistics.
Interesting. So tell us about your work at Salesforce.
Yeah, so I've been at Salesforce for, 4.5 years now, I think. And I started out working in user experience research because my background really is in qualitative research methods by way of linguistics. And about 1.5 years into when I was at the company, that's when we started developing our Einstein bot platform, which is essentially a builder that exists on the Salesforce platform, whereby Salesforce users can create text-based chatbots to interact with their customers through our messaging channels. And because it lives on the Salesforce platform, it has access to all the information that you put into the Salesforce platform about your customers. And so it can be this highly contextual, highly informed, text-based conversation experience. And so when I heard that they were working on something like this, I was like, everybody out of my way, I want to work on that, because I was so excited to be able to bring to bear the study that I did.
Yeah.
I'm super nerdy about things like conversational style and discourse markers and how you can leverage those things to create a really rich and robust experience for users. So I moved over to the Einstein bots team, and that's where I've been since. Since that time, over the course of the past couple of years, conversation design has really started to take a life of its own and come into the forefront. I was moonlighting as a conversation designer while I was formerly a researcher, because at the time, the demand maybe wasn't quite as at the forefront. But now it's really taking center stage because growth for Einstein bots is through the roof. In the last 6 months, I have seen Einstein bots growth. I believe it's 176% growth we've seen in the last six months, which is, I think, speaks to the trend of the customer service industry in terms of automating customer service and really rotating in the direction of a digital strategy. And so as a result of that, I think more focus has been put on conversation as the UX, as the experience. And so that's really where I saw the opportunity to then transition into a formal role for conversation design. And I started Salesforce's first conversation design practice in May. So that's what I've been doing since May. Conversation design is now a thing at Salesforce, which I'm very excited to announce. And since then, I've been working with customers and internal teams as well as partners on their strategy and approach to conversation design for Einstein bots.
So I'm sure that must be very exciting for you now.
Yeah, it's a thrill. I love the work.
Yeah, bringing your experience from your academics background and then being able to leverage it at the company who's already working at scale at different levels for enterprise, and now bringing in the chatbot, which is really exciting. Are there any plans for, voice enabling any of these?
Yeah, so we worked on voice, I think last year time runs together for me now as a result of the lockdown, but we have shifted direction for the moment. Right now we're focusing mostly on text, but I don't rule anything out. So we haven't done anything like a formal statement around voice or anything, and there haven't been any discussions internally that I'm aware of around it. But I'm the kind of person where I say never. So
of course,
we'll see.
I can see that happening, especially, I don't know, there may be many use cases, maybe I'm not aware of, but in the enterprise world, voice can also enable a lot of things. So
Yes.
Talking about Einstein and talking about the use cases, what are the kind of unique use cases in the enterprise world for using a chatbot?
Sure. I think the sort of primary use case that comes to mind really comes in the realm of customer service. That's where we're seeing the most growth these days in Einstein bots. I think particularly when it comes to things like, how can we automate at scale the very frequent but like somewhat low touch questions that you might get from a customer? So something like, the intent is I want to reset my password, or I want to check the status of my order. Things like that pertaining to customer service that have to do with the customer service lifecycle that I think are really at the forefront. Some of the more interesting niche use cases that I'm seeing outside of customer service are things like in sales, for example. Like in the sales world, we would call it create a lead. But the intent on the user side might be something like they want to learn more about a product, or they want to connect with somebody in the sales department. Those types of things are signals to sales that this is potentially a warm lead, and so you would want to intake them into the system. So I think that's a particularly fun use case where it seems pretty easy, right? If you've got a customer who's on your website and they're already digging around and the chatbot is there, if they want to engage further, then ideally you can leverage Einstein bots on the Salesforce platform to create a lead record where you can just intake that person and then it just moves forward in the life cycle of sales. So that's, I think, on the sales side. I think also there's some relation there to marketing. So when we think about marketing and digital strategies and marketing, lead generation is a big focus there. And so that helps on the marketing side as well. I think I've seen other things like in the realm of education, like I think industry specific bots are now starting to percolate and there's discussions around that. So like in the realm of education, as you've got students who are trying to matriculate into a university or apply to a university, I think right now we're in the middle of like student application season. So things that those are customer service or sales use cases, but then you might apply to a particular industry. And for education, that might look like something where you got an interested applicant and you want to provide them more information, or you maybe want to connect them to a counselor or somebody at the university to help them move their application forward or apply for financial aid. Things like that, where you go from the broader, I think, use cases around customer service, sales, and marketing, and then apply them to a specific industry like education. That's also a pattern that I'm seeing.
Yeah, a lot of use cases, and I feel like all of them are exciting opportunities. I was recently studying, looking at an article, and I found that voice assistants are being used in manufacturing, especially not in manufacturing, more of a fulfillment, just to track orders and then make sure all the items are in place and all of those kind of things, like more of an management and those kind of things. So do you anytime see lead management could become a use case where you are entering lead information through voice, or is it through just original modality like you have?
I mean, for now, at least the way that Salesforce is doing it on Einstein bots, because Einstein bots is just officially text-based at the moment, that it's all done through text. I think more broadly across the industry, outside of Salesforce, I could certainly see that as a thing, because as you're dictating to the system information about the lead, I could certainly see that as potential
One
direction.
of the use cases. Yeah, definitely. It will be interesting to see like how Salesforce changes the dynamics with the Einstein, because definitely from the time it was launched, a lot of momentum has been gained by bot, which is interesting. And just understanding from you, like 160 or 170, how much did you say?
176% growth.
Yeah, that's a huge growth, right?
Yeah.
That's like, yes, future is conversational and we have to start thinking about it. So that
Absolutely.
What benefits do you think the enterprise bots would give to any business?
I think honestly, from my perspective, because as a conversation designer, I always think about everything in terms of the customer and the user experience. And so when the question about how bots fits into the benefits for a company, I think beyond just the affordance it could provide when it comes to scale, I also think it's an opportunity to scale that personal touch, if you will, where you've got agents who are talking to your customers and who largely in my research on customer service get provided some sort of set of guidelines about the voice and tone of the company, the voice and tone of the brand, some sort of talking points that they might have to hit as a result of talking to a customer. I would encourage businesses to think about the bot in the same way. Like in the same way that you would provide that type of investment in your customer service agents, you should do the same for your Einstein bot, because it provides a way for you to kind of show customers what your institution is all about. What do you value? How do you communicate that through language? And I think that's really where I think excitement lies for me, is it's not just about, okay, how many calls did we deflect or how many chats did we deflect from our agents, but how did we show the customer that even through providing a bot as a way for them to get self-service, that it feels personal. And you can do that through conversation design. And that's really where I think the power lies.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've mostly seen people thinking about a customer care bot just to, optimize the operational cost. The agents don't have to take too many calls and maybe the bot can take. And in fact, when I was thinking about the use cases, that was pretty much how I was pushing that use cases added. So thinking about it as your brand's most important touch point, I think will make a lot of sense, right?
Yeah, I think just like at a basic level, the way that we would think about it is scale, right? So like one of our customers, Sunbasket, it's a healthy meal delivery service that is like designed by chefs in pre-boxed meal kits. And they're based out of the South Bay here in California. And as a result of the pandemic, they've seen their customer base doubled in just 6 weeks, and they have this 50% increase in customer service cases. And so when we think about just from the aspect of scale, yes, you would want bots to be able to help touch more customers and make that contact. But I think on top of that, when I think of the investment in the conversation design aspect of it, where you can think very meticulously about, okay, how is the bot going to communicate? Here's how you would get a replacement ingredient, or there's an ingredient that's missing from your box, or how would you go about accessing your account or changing your address, or things like that. You could potentially provide a much highly personal or personable conversation design that would scale to users, so that way they feel that from your brand. And I think that's really where the differentiation we're seeing among bots now. So as a result of the lockdowns worldwide, we've seen this proliferation of bots, but the ones that stand out are the ones where the institution has, or the organization has, invested very strategically and prominently in conversation design. How is it going to differentiate itself from the other bots? It's got a little bit of personality and it expresses it in these ways. And there is a very clear sort of party line about when to use emojis and when not to use them, or if they use them at all. Making sure that it's very much a reflection of your brand, I think really is the key differentiator these days.
So coming back to the Einstein bot, so I'm assuming you have a bot builder as well, which allows other companies to leveraging all the data which they already have with you, creating their own bot. So how much of customization does Einstein allow for brands and companies to start adding these kind of things, like the tone of the voice or the personality aspect of it?
Yeah, in true Salesforce fashion, your Einstein bot is highly customizable. You can customize it to do essentially whatever you want it to in terms of conversational style in chat. So if you want to put emojis in, you can use the emoji picker in Apple to put them in right into the text composer for the chat. You can customize how long or short the response delays are between turns whenever the bot is interacting with the customer. And then there are also these defaults that come out of the box. So for example, I did research in Manila in the Philippines with chat agents in a customer service center to observe, okay, how long does it take for them to respond to users over chat? And what is that sort of comfortable cadence? In voice, we know from linguistic research that any pause that lasts a little bit longer than 1 second tends to be a predictor of something that's maybe not so preferable in conversation. So you want the pauses to be a little bit shorter there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that metric can transfer over to chat. And what I found in Manila, working with my colleague on UX design, Molly Mahar, we discovered that if you are responding to someone over chat, that it takes about 4 seconds at the fastest for an agent to reply, because you're typing. Your muscles in your fingers are a little bit slower than the muscles in your vocal tract. And so since that part was acceptable, that gave us a guidance around what we wanted to set the bot response delay as Einstein Bot Builder. You essentially want it to be faster than a human, so for optimization reasons, but you don't want it to be so fast that it will overwhelm the user and come across as artificial. So that's how we came up with a 1.2 second default bot response delay. And so if you just click that, then it sets your bot response delay at that default, and you can make it longer, up to 3 seconds, because we still want to make it more efficient than a human, but we don't recommend going under 1.2 seconds. So you can have customization around all of those features of language within Einstein bots. You can also customize the records that you're calling from the Salesforce platform. So you can use rules and flow, which is another feature in Salesforce on the platform, to be able to call specific records or call specific information about a given contact or customer. You can also use Flow to create objects or create records on the Salesforce platform, such as creating a lead or creating a case. One thing that I'm very excited about on Einstein bots, which we just released in October into beta, is the intro template bot, which is our first template and first Salesforce native conversation design, which I'm biased because I worked on it and the conversation designs are mine. And I worked on it with our CX folks and product and UX. But it essentially provides users the ability to, Salesforce administrators, the ability to be able to just launch a bot from the template, and they'll have 4 key intents that are serviced through a menu-driven bot experience. Connect with sales or create a lead, create a case if you wanted to log a case through the bot, check existing order status, and then check an existing case status. And so all of those things come native, but then you can still customize the conversation design. If you don't like how I did it, You don't have to keep it. You can change it to whatever you like.
But you are giving them the option or something pre-built in so that they can leverage it and start building over it. So if someone doesn't know what to do, how to do, right?
Exactly. They can follow.
So for someone, for example, you have a lot of customers and you just mentioned, one of the customers who was in
Sunbasket.
Sunbasket, yeah. So if they were to design a conversational bot, do they need to have a conversational designer to do that? Or how does that work? How will they know how to design the bot?
Yeah, I think what I'm seeing across the landscape of our customers, and even what I'm hearing from other folks at other institutions, there are folks who are from the outset dedicated to conversation design, but more frequently we're seeing folks who are falling into the conversation design role and they weren't necessarily expecting it. And that can happen to UX designers, that can happen to copywriters, UX writers, documentation people, or even Salesforce administrators, where now they are responsible for either the copy or the entire bot implementation. And as a result, they're also responsible for conversation design. I don't know that's necessarily scalable, because conversation design is such, it's a compounded effort. So like bots, first of all, chatbots as technology that you implement are not the type of technology where you set and forget it. You have to consistently maintain and prune and clean it. And as a result, you're constantly iterating on the bot. When it comes to conversation design, that's almost 2 or 3-fold, because every time you make a change to the bot, then you have to review it. You have to make sure that it doesn't break anything in terms of the rules of the flow. You have to make sure that you usability test it with actual users, so that way your designs, they actually make sense when it comes to the conversational flow. You are likely going to do some sort of review with PR or legal or content experience, the folks who are essentially representing the brand or the face of the company. So that way it might be in favor of the customer, but maybe it's not something that we can promise from a legal perspective or what have you. And so that all takes effort, that all takes time on top of whatever your base role is. And so ideally you would have someone who is focused specifically on conversation design, so that way they can dedicate their full capacity to those responsibilities.
Yeah. That's a lot of work, of course. Like sometimes you need to include so many different stakeholders, including legal for sure. And depending on the kind of business, there may be other protocols which has to be followed. Yeah, having a dedicated designer definitely helps a lot.
Yeah.
So what are the building blocks or components when designing a conversational bot?
Components. I think so I sort of think of this question from 2 perspectives: the overall bot implementation perspective and then the conversation design perspective. I think from the overall implementation perspective, it depends on what your end goal is. Like, I look at it from the lens of just the regular product development lifecycle. So what is your MVP or your minimum viable product? What is that core functionality that you're trying to serve? You don't want to get too fancy too quickly. So if you're like, I want a bot that can handle 7 intents and they're all NLP enabled and it's a bunch of open questions, I'm like, okay, great, I'll see you in 2 years, because it's a huge effort. Whereas if you're thinking about, okay, your customers right now need access at scale, what is the most important or most frequently referenced intent that you're seeing in your existing chat data that has the lowest amount of lift in terms of what the agent needs to do in order to satisfy? That's your sweet spot. And then once you have an idea of what that use case is, then think through, okay, how can we go step by step to enable this using a menu? And then as you continue to deploy that and test it out with users, you can collect utterances whereby you can then train an intent and then continue to grow it. And so I think that as you grow your implementation, that's when you can consider things like flow, which is a Salesforce feature that helps scale Einstein bots. When it comes to conversation design in particular, I would say the main components are certainly things like, you have to have a greeting. You have to start the conversation somehow, but you also have to have an ending. Conversations end, they start and they end. And so you have to think very strategically about how you want your closing to work. Is the user going to say goodbye? Is the bot going to say goodbye? Is there even a goodbye sequence at all? Thank you can sometimes mean goodbye. Do you need, even after the user or the bot says goodbye, does the user still need to click X on the window in order to close things out? So thinking through how that closing sequence works is important just as much as the opening sequence. Again, the cadence of things. So the bot response delay, I would consider another component of the experience. Things like thank you. So if the bot is showing gratitude to the user or receiving gratitude from the user, it needs to be able to understand that. Nothing would be more artificial than if the user said thanks and the bot said, I'm sorry, I don't understand. I think apologies are an important thing to consider specifically for customer service interactions at the enterprise level. It's important because you don't want to be overly apologetic, but at the same time, customers and users expect to hear I'm sorry or some kind of acknowledgement that it's unfortunate in an experience which maybe is less than favorable for them. So for example, if I tried to reset my password and you couldn't do it for me, then how do you communicate that this isn't, that you as the bot and thereby the institution recognize that this is not ideal for the customer? And so for some customers and users on Einstein bots, that might be I'm sorry. For others, it might be, well, unfortunately, or you could leverage a discourse marker like well, which shows that you're deviating from whatever the previous options were to indicate that something is less than desired. I think other components would be if you're trying to make some sort of attempt at gathering info from the customer. So like creating a lead, for example. The way that we did it in the Einstein bot intro template bot is if you dig into, and anybody can take a look at this. If you go to developer.salesforce.com, you can request a free 30-day trial of Salesforce. And then if you just go into setup and type in bot, Einstein bots will come out. And if you create one, the intro template bot is available for you there. And what we did was we didn't want to have to create the get user info component from scratch for both creating a case and creating a lead. Rather, we wanted to reference that one instance of having to gather the user's information over and over again. Because let's say you as a customer are interested in learning more about a product, but you also want to create a case about an issue that you're having with the product that you already have from that same company. If you give your information for a lead, you don't want to have to give your information again from scratch and repeat all that for the case. We should be able to leverage that existing dialogue and then port that information in for your case and say, okay, so you gave us your name, you gave us your email, I just need your phone number, because that's what a human would do. So thinking about reusable components like that as well, such as getting user information. Those would be, I would say the core components for a conversation design on a bot for customer service.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I love how you said like they need to have intro and they need to have outro. Like thinking about someone like my son. Every time my mom calls from India and she's, hey Sid, how are you? He's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then she doesn't know what to say next. Like,
yeah.
Doing nothing.
Yep. Exactly.
So if the bot is responding like that, if the bot is completely doesn't know what to do next or how to continue the conversation, then it is going to users.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting because those are just different conversational styles. If that's how your institution responds to customers where they're even your human service agents, they also just say, hi, good, okay. And that's how your brand works. Okay, like maybe that's just how it works. But if it doesn't, like if your brand is very much, thank you so much for being right, exactly. And your bot just goes, okay, that could come across as a little perhaps cold or indifferent. And so it's important to think through what that looks like. Like I've had whole debates at work about whether or not the utterance needs to end in an ellipsis, a colon, or an exclamation point. And folks are like, if we put the exclamation point, it's going to make it seem we're potentially sarcastic because they're doing it when it relates to, like, we're in the middle of the create your case dialogue. They're not, the customer is not necessarily excited to be creating a case. So why should we say, okay, with an exclamation point? We shouldn't be happy that they have an issue. So maybe we should do those types of discussions. I think are extremely nuanced, but also extremely important to have when it comes to, because it's your brand. It's what we're talking about, your brand.
Definitely. So moving on to the best practices. So we've been talking
Oh, yeah.
about some of these things. We have the conversational components, and moving on, like you were just talking about how like these small nuances are also important when we are designing the conversation. So what are the other best practices someone needs to consider when they are designing conversational AI?
Yeah, I think broadly, I like to chunk that up into parts. So the first part that comes to mind from your first pillar really is around transparency. Like I said, the bot needs to be very clear to the user that the user is not talking to a human, because unless you're using like a bot avatar or some kind of different font or changing something about the graphical UI of the chat window itself, it's not going to readily signal to the user that they're not talking to a human. And at Salesforce, our number one value is trust. We want to make sure that our customers feel trust with us, that we trust our customers, that you cultivate that as part of the relationship between user and institution, or user and company, customer and company. And so in order to promote trust, you want to be transparent about who the customer is interacting with. So I would say first and foremost, you have to make sure to signify to the user that they are indeed talking to a bot. I think the next thing would be around, again, thinking through the personality or conversational style of the bot. There needs to be a conscious effort, even in the beginning. Don't wait too long. You don't want to get further down the pike when it comes to designing the bot and the conversation design and then think, okay, what is the conversational style of the bot? Should I use an exclamation point? Should I use an emoji? Should I not? That should be decided from the get-go, at least to a degree. So I have this worksheet that I like to use with customers and with partners, where if they're creating a bot for the first time, within the first couple of discussions, I bust it out and I say, okay, so how would you describe the bot's personality in a couple of adjectives? How similar or different is it from the way that your company or organization expresses its brand in other media, whether that's advertisements or what have you? How does it convey this style or this personality in a greeting, in a closing, in an apology, when it expresses gratitude? All of those things to be able to give the conversation designer some form of reference to say, okay, this is how we do apologies, so I'm not going to put an emoji here. So that's extremely important, I think, in the beginning as well. And it will grow, but you need a starting point, and that needs to exist in the beginning. I think then also after that, the next part would be to think through the structure of how everything works. The information architecture, so how are you structuring the bot? Where do all the different dialogues live? You might have cases where you have dialogues that you don't want to necessarily offer out in the beginning because it could potentially overwhelm the user. And so what I mean by this is when you're providing examples to the user in the opening turn of chat of what the bot can actually do for the user, which is a best practice, absolutely, because research has shown that users feel some sense of anxiety as to how to get the bot to trigger the bot to act in a way that adheres to what they need. Giving examples helps with that. But you don't want to give them too many examples. So if you give them like 7 menu items, then now all of a sudden they have to scroll up and down. It's high cognitive load. Who can remember all of that? And so potentially you might not surface all of your dialogues in that opening menu. Maybe you only surface 3 or 4. Maybe for customer service organizations, for example, there's a tough balance to strike, because from the user experience perspective and the trust perspective, we say, give the user a way out, give them an escape hatch. You don't want to trap them in the experience. But then customer service organizations are like, yeah, but we also, like, the whole point is to deflect. We don't want to encourage them to keep hitting up humans. If we can surface it, they should at least go through a couple turns in the bot. And so one way I've thought about approaching that is you can have a dialogue that is create a case, or you can have a dialogue for escalate to an agent or a human agent. And they can live inside the bot, but maybe it's not something you surface in that opening menu. You might surface, okay, here's a few things I can do for you, or anything else, and then maybe you can give a few more examples. But if you train NER to respond to things like human, talk to a human, create a case, or log a ticket, or whatever, it can then trigger those dialogues that they weren't necessarily surfaced in the opening turn, but they live inside the bot. And so it's almost like the escape hatch is there, and we're not saying, here it is, but it's like maybe to your left, and you can discover it there. So I think that part of the structure and the information architecture is really important. And then the last best practice I would say is around being iterative. So making sure, again, like, it's not set and forget. how are users interacting with your dialogues? Where is the drop off, if at all? If there is drop off, can you dig into that a little bit more and see, is there something about the conversation design? Is there a bug? You can troubleshoot and be a little bit more surgical about how you approach that. But then also, let's say you have an intent enabled bot. You have to make sure to check that your intents are balanced and healthy. So in the Einstein Bot Builder, we have a intent management dashboard, essentially, where you can see all of your intents and see how they're doing in terms of balance and making sure, because you won't know unless you actively check. And so being iterative about the bot again and pruning the dialogues as a result, I think is also a best practice.
So yeah, these are all very important, especially presenting the options. How many do you present? How do you even choose what kind of option should we present? Because there are so many things a business can do. And if you ask a customer service agent, or if you ask like business people or marketing people, they would have their own set of options. Like these are critical, these are very important, and they all need
Yes.
to be like in the first menu list, for example.
Totally.
These are the things the bot wants to. How do you even decide, or what do you recommend that, how do you decide choosing those options? Like these are the things you should be asking, and then maybe follow on. These are some other things I can do for you.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm biased. As a researcher, my first thought is I'm like, show me the data. So if you can look at your chat logs and see, or even and your case history for chats across your organization, whether it's sales, marketing, or service, you can see across those, okay, what are the most frequent types of things that customers are asking for or trying to do? And that I think will help guide you, where when you take that list of, okay, here's what customers are trying to do over chat, and then you cross-reference that against, okay, how much work is it going to actually take for us to do that? And is it something that can be serviced by a bot? If yes, then that's going to help you constrain what items. You can just pick from the top 3 and shave that off the top of the list. I would say that it's also important to consider, you don't want your bot to do too many things. So you might be able to say in the opening sequence for the first menu, for example, here's some things I can help you with. And then maybe you can pick like the top example from service, the top example from sales, and potentially the top example from marketing. Likely, I would expect that the marketing and sales ones would probably overlap, because if they have to do with leads, then maybe that saves you a menu item where, okay, we're going to put a menu item in here for connect with sales. That's going to trigger the flow for creating a lead record for this user or for this customer. And we still have 2 or 3 other slots that we can fill in the menu for other things. It's likely that most of the menu items will probably gear towards service, because that's where a lot, I think, of the demand is. But then you balance that with your stakeholders and have a discussion with them and say, hey, okay, so we want to make sure to scale and help service, but I also know that you want to generate revenue in some way, and lead generation is a pathway toward that. So we can include this here, and just have a frank discussion with them about what that balance looks like. I think that progressive disclosure as a UX principle, as UX tool, is a really good one to use, particularly in bots, where if you think about it, like if it were human to human and I call into an agent, they're not going to say, so I can help you reset your password, I can help you change your address, I can help you update your credit card, I can help you connect with, like, they don't rattle off absolutely everything they can do for you. And the reason is because they can troubleshoot. They have that conversational capacity to be able to repair trouble and disambiguate, et cetera. Bots are still trying to get better at that. But I think that the principle of progressive disclosure still comes in handy there, where you can say, here's a few things I can help you with, and then maybe here's anything else, or a way for you to peel the layer back one more, or peel one more layer back and see what else the bot can do for you.
I like the progressive disclosure. Like in UX, we try to do that too, right? Like when we are creating graphical interfaces, we don't give too many informations and we make it contextual. And then we try to give information one at a time, like peeling the onion.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely, definitely. So yeah, these are all great best practices for sure. How about ending with questions? So some people say you should always end with a question so that the conversation continues and you're not killing it.
Mm-hmm. I think it depends. So for example, you might be able to use menus to move the conversation forward, and you're like, syntactically, it's not a question. You're asking the user or I hate to use the word command, but like you're instructing the user to engage further. So it might be like, click on an option below. That's not a question, but you are continuing the conversation in that way. I also think that you don't want to over-rotate in the direction of doing too many things too many times, whether that is asking a question or apologizing or thanking the customer, because repetition in conversation is actually something that is strategic, that people strategically use to create emphasis or to create cohesion across the entire discussion. If you repeat things too often, then it could potentially annoy the user. So because you might be inadvertently emphasizing something that you don't intend to emphasize. So if you keep ending with a question, a user might recognize that, where after the third or fourth time, they're like, am I like being interrogated here or something like that? So change it up. Like maybe you could, if you want to keep the conversation going, you could ask the user to engage with something with a statement and say, click on something here or check out blah, blah, instead of asking them a question in a question format.
So you said like also think about the endings, right? So how about endings? So in the endings, is there anything else I can help you with, or do you even think about those kind of things?
I do. I don't know, because I'm very risk averse as a person. So I like to just double check and say, hey, is there anything else that I can help you with before we're over? I send that in my emails and everything. So I'm a little biased there. But I don't trigger I essentially put that in an anything else dialogue, and then I don't trigger the anything else dialogue to happen unless it's right before the closing. So if they've reached particularly at the end of a sequence inside, or a flow, a dialogue flow inside of the bot, now the question is, do you want to keep going or are we done here? And that's the only instance in which I would ask them, is there anything else? When it comes to the ending of the conversation itself, I think it's important to consider the variation there as well. Like sometimes that's goodbye, maybe sometimes it's just thank you. When I think about like when you go in, well, this example used to be more pervasive before the lockdown, but when you go in person to get a coffee and you pick up the coffee from the barista and you walk away, do you say goodbye? No, maybe you say thank you and that's it. And by turning away and walking away, that in and of itself is goodbye. And so maybe thank you is enough. And then by closing the window, that's goodbye. So I think everything has variation. And you can use that as a conversation designer, you can use that to your advantage to make the experience more robust. I'm also a songwriter. So like when I think about writing a song, you don't want to use the same line over and over again. You don't want to be overly repetitive. The chorus only shows up in a certain cadence. And so like when you're creating a bot, it's the same thing where like when I'm doing the conversation design, I'm like, okay, I just used the word okay in the last utterance. Do I want to use it again, or can I use something like got it instead? So think about that variation and how you can signal similar meaning, but not necessarily repeating it over and over.
So how do you ensure when you are doing these variations, it still sticks to your branding traits?
Yeah, I think for me, that's about curating a list of what fits within the brand. So for example, I don't want to overly use exclamation points for Salesforce as a brand, because that's just not how Salesforce communicates in external facing media. That said, maybe occasionally I will use an exclamation point or perhaps an emoji to signal that enthusiasm. And so what I do is I create this like repository of, here are all the different ways I could acknowledge the receipt of information. How am I going to do that in this turn, given that last turn I used okay? Or okay, I use like there'll be times when I'll do it as an audit. Like as for folks who are writers, they often I think know that you don't want to write and edit at the same time. And it's hard to parse that apart, but take that first pass, do your conversation design, get the first pass on paper, so to speak, or into the builder or whatever tool you're using for the conversation design, and then go back through and see, okay, I have ended all of these sequences or all of these dialogues with got it. Maybe 2 of the 4 of them, I will change them to okay. But then, does that follow from the previous utterance? So like, it's about going through with that fine tooth comb and saying, what does the variation look like? How does it map to the list of variants that I have curated that fit with the brand? And then also seeking feedback from my partners, whether that's PR or marketing or content experience.
Yeah, this is great. This is great. So definitely there's a lot for people to consider when they are designing conversational experiences in general.
Yes,
But the moment it comes to enterprise, it's a little bit more tricky because now you
totally.
start thinking about a lot more things than just the consumer driven thing. Hey, play
Right.
this for me, or what's the weather kind of things.
Yes. Yeah, I think from a, like, for me, actually, I also find it somewhat helpful in that, like, the guardrails for like enterprise related conversation, it gives me a little bit more definition. Like when I worked on Cortana, for example, at Microsoft, because it's so open-ended, it's like you could do anything. And that's really intimidating, honestly, as a designer. I'm like, okay, if I could do anything, where do I start? Whereas with enterprise, it's okay, we are starting with these basic transactions. I get a lot of questions about things like chit chat. And chit chat, I think, it's like peanut buttering the whole like relationship building aspect of conversation. I think of conversation across two axes. I think of it across a transactional axis where you're trying to get something done because you're always trying to do something in conversation. But then I also think about it in terms of like, what are we doing with our relationship? How are we negotiating our relationship closeness and distance from each other as a result of what we say and how we say it? And so I think like chit chat in and of itself is like overly simplifying or being reductive about that relationship axis, and being able to pinpoint and say, okay, we are trying to help the user reset their password, but we are also trying to convey to the user that we care about their experience. You can do both of those in the reset password dialogue. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. Chit chat isn't the only way. Chit chat isn't the only way to build a relationship with the user.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So how do you even know that relationship or the trust is built? How do you measure your conversations?
That's a great question. I think that measuring user trust and measuring that relationship, I think, can be done in several different ways. CSAT, I think, is not enough. You'd want to triangulate it against other points of data. That's just one aspect of things. And I think CSAT, as a result of the proliferation of bots, we might see CSAT, or customer satisfaction. For those who aren't familiar, in the customer service industry, when you're engaged in chat with an agent or something like that, that at the end of the chat, it'll ask, so how was your experience today? That's customer satisfaction. And agents get rated on that based on their CSAT scores. I think that as a result of the proliferation of bots, there's going to more and more folks are asking, how do we track success? How do we know that the bot is actually good? And there's going to be a need to disentangle CSAT from the experience of the conversation itself. How was your experience today? You're layering everything together. They might be dissatisfied with the service itself in that they don't like that they weren't able to get a refund. But the conversation was perfectly fine. And so how do we start to disentangle that a little bit and say, okay, so they don't necessarily like the outcome or the policy, but like the conversation design, it's all right. Like it was at least able to get them to their answer. And so I think it's going to be important for us as an industry to consider, okay, what does that metric start to look like? I think that when we think about metrics overall with a conversation, drop off is another thing that you could see in there. Average handling time is also going to get further complicated because, again, you have that access of transaction, but you have that access of relationship, and they're almost in competition with each other because you want to get a speedy solution to a transaction as a customer service organization. But if you want to build a relationship, that takes time. And so taking time and finishing the interaction quickly, those are fighting with each other. And so thinking through, okay, how are we going to balance this? Yes, it took a long time for the user to get through this conversation with a bot, but is that bad? Were they able to get a solution at the end, or did it get a high rating on bot satisfaction or whatever metric we decide to encapsulate there? If so, then maybe that's not such a bad thing. So I think metrics around tracking conversation are only going to get further more complex. Things like negation and repetition are linguistic indicators that show that something isn't going quite as positively in the conversation as we would like. So that might be something that we continue to track throughout the transcripts, for example. But I think that is just continuing to grow across the industry. And I'm excited to see where it goes.
Definitely. Like these are all great points, like knowing when they are dropping off, knowing how long the conversation lasted, and then they abandoned the conversation, and whether the conversation yielded a positive result or handing off to a customer care agent. And all of those things are really important metrics which can tell us what needs to be done for sure.
Absolutely. Exactly. Because you want to know, like from a design perspective, you want to know, okay, do I need to call engineering, or is this something that I can fix?
Yeah, those are great points. So for someone young wanting to get into conversational AI space, what would be the suggestions and recommendations from your end?
Ooh, someone trying to get into conversational AI. I would say definitely do a lot of digging around online and observing of your interaction with bots. So since my sort of foray into conversational AI, everyone in my life, I think, thinks that they need to tell me about their experience with bots or voice or whatever, whether it's my family or my friends or whoever it is. Like, oh, I talked to a bot today and it sucked like this. I think that, or it was great in this way. I think it's important as a conversation designer for you to gather those types of examples for yourself and be able to articulate to hiring committees and say, hey, so this is an experience that I had with this particular bot. This is what I would change and why. And if I change it in this way, it does this for the experience. Being able to show that argumentation, I would say there's so much great content out there. The work that you're doing with this podcast, Shamala, I think is a great example of that. There's also Voice Lunch. There's lots of these virtual meetups and podcasts and series that I think are available for designers now. So definitely just consume. Network. Definitely in the Voice Lunch, I think is a great opportunity to network and meet with folks. And I would say to build your portfolio, try out some tools. Einstein bots, you can get, like I said, if you go to developer.salesforce.com, you can get a free trial of Salesforce, and Einstein bots is part of that. Play around in there, build some bots, see what you can do. And then you can take examples of those and put those in your portfolio and show, okay, here's what I would do and why, and here's what it looks like in the experience. So those would be, and I guess the one thing I would add also is read the book, That's Not What I Meant by Deborah Tannen. That book is, I think, it's a linguistics book that is meant for non-linguists. And I think it's very much at the core of how I think about language and conversation at scale. So I'm super biased there, but I highly recommend that book as well.
Yeah, we'll make sure we add it into our show notes as well, because that's really important. And if someone wants to learn about linguistics and they don't want to do the entire degree, but still want to get into conversation design, so are there any resources available where they can just go and learn about some of those things?
Yeah, so there is, oh my gosh, I'm actually embarrassed because I'm blanking on the name, and it's because I'm like, my mind is a little scattered at the moment, but there is a great new podcast educational series on linguistics that is on YouTube that I believe is produced by Superlinguo Professor Jesse Grieser and Gretchen McCulloch, who is the author of Because Internet. And they have, I think, put together a series that is great about the basics of linguistics. Another book that I would recommend is called The 5-Minute Linguist, which is, and I think they're on the 3rd edition of it, but it is essentially this little-ish handbook of papers that have been written by linguists across the entire field, where they are really short and they're meant for people who don't know anything about linguistics. Like they're, I think, 2-page papers at least, and they were done by, I don't know, like 50 linguists. I think that's a great reader, whether that is questions about linguistics pertaining to the digital and internet space, or linguistics pertaining to things like language, learning or language teaching or what have you, language change. So I definitely recommend that book as well. That's Not What I Meant by Deborah Tannen is another great book. And one that I think is a little bit more academic, but I'm so biased towards because I think it's so powerful, is the book called Discourse Markers by Deborah Schifrin. It might take a few tries to read it for non-linguists, but I think it's really important to show that these tiny little filler words that we're taught in English are distracting and useless and you shouldn't use them actually have meaning and they're really powerful and you absolutely should use them. And if I had a nickel for every time someone was like, this conversation design feels so natural, I'm like, it's really just discourse markers. That's what does the trick.
You're right. You're right.
Yeah, so I think I highly recommend that book. It will give you a sense of how words like, oh, but, words like that can actually create cohesion, can create this natural flow of conversation. Highly recommend it.
Yeah, I think for us, we don't know when and how we use it. Especially with me, I use a lot. And
Yeah.
it comes just like that because I'm trying to think about certain things.
Yes.
Right? So that's like maybe a break in between or something like that.
Totally. And even the word, it's so controversial, the word, but it's got such variation, such meaning, and you can use it in a really powerful way. So I think that I'm really nerdy and passionate about discourse markers. I think that they are really strong for conversation design and I don't think they get enough attention. So I highly recommend that.
Absolutely. We'll make sure we add all of these things in our show notes for sure. This was an incredible conversation with you, Greg.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me. I had so much fun and thanks for giving me a chance to be super nerdy and talk through some fun ideas.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. You have so many great insights and I'm sure like the listeners would have a lot of great learnings from you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. And if folks have any questions, I'm always happy to engage.
Yeah, I'll also make sure we add the social links where they connect with you as well.
Yes, I will give you all the stuff.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Shamala.
Thanks for listening today. If you would like to post a voice comment, please go to www.witlingo.com/daa. That's www.witlingo.com/daa. We'd love to hear from you. Remember, you can find all the information on becoming a certified voice interaction designer, along with show notes and more at our website, digitalassistant.academy. That's digitalassistant.academy. We encourage your feedback and questions. Be sure to get in touch by using the contact page at the Digital Assistant Academy's website. We will include the link in the show notes. In our next episode, Mike Coppins, head of conversational UX at Greenshoot Labs, talks about empathy and inclusion in conversation design. Until next week, take care.